Bible Answers with Dr. Al Garza.
All right, welcome back. I am your host, Dr. Al Garza. All right, so today I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to read a couple of emails I've got regarding some questions on some things I spoke of on my last few videos regarding the debate between Dr. White and Jason. So this is regarding some emails regarding Romans chapter 8 and a couple of things regarding some ways that might have been answered based on the terminology used between Dr. White and Jason, and how non-Calvinists and Calvinists have different interpretations and different word usages or understandings. So let me start with this. I understand this is Jason's first debate, and it had to be extremely, nerve-wracking to go against someone like Dr. White, who's done hundreds of debates. I can relate to being new to something and then doing something in a way that was beyond, what I thought I should do the first time. When I first got my black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I went to a tournament with some of my students, and I was asked to compete, in a friendly competition. It was last minute. I said okay, and it was against a very well-seasoned black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I knew, all I can do is do my best, try to do whatever I can just to, not look like, I don't know what I'm doing. And so I understand the pressure. I understand it is nerve wracking to an extent. But Jason did a really good job. He held his own. I know that people say all the time, you could have done this differently or that differently. But again, unless you're in that seat, being your first debate, and someone like Dr. White, who's done hundreds, we don't really know how it is unless we've experienced it ourselves. So we can say things from hindsight, of course, and say, oh, we should have said this, should have said that. I think Jason did a great job. So I say, if you're watching Jason, great job. I commend you on it. It's a learning experience. Of course, you can always go back and reevaluate and say, I'm going to do this next time differently. So it's something you can look back on and definitely learn from. But a couple of things I want to say about this. I have good friends. Well, I'll be honest, they're not really good friends anymore. I had good friends who became Calvinists based on books they've read and with really little research at all. Just read some books on Calvinism by Piper or even White, and all of a sudden, boom, they're a Calvinist. And some influences of some other people on the outside. These are friends that I've known for over 15 years. So it was kind of, a little bit sad to see them go that way in the respect of, moving away from what the text of the Bible really says and falling into more of a traditional man-made centered religion called Calvinism. And I say that because I know what it's like to debate with them, discuss with them. These people that were friends of mine are now pastors. Some of them are pastors, some of them are teachers, some of them are still holding on to Calvinism. Maybe they're not that much into it, but they still believe it. And so I've always dialogued with them. I've known who they are. We've talked on Facebook many times. I've met with them here and there. So I know the frustration sometimes when we deal and talk with them, the things they say and do. And recently I was watching a video by Jeff Durbin, and he's talking about how non-Calvinists, and he has titles for them, obviously, in different names, but Pelagianism and all this stuff. But he was talking about how, we're man-centered. If you got to get away from your man-centered tradition, religion, and all this. And he was defending Calvinism. And he's calling our position, people who are non-Calvinists, man-made traditions. And I thought that was very projecting, very, very funny in a way. Because if you look at Calvinism itself, you have a group of people who are called Calvinists based on John Calvin, which is a man, and it's centered on his theology. It goes back to Augustine, and so they center themselves around an individual, but yet they're calling non-Calvinists man-made centered religion. Well, that's kind of ironic in a way, because I can get 100 non-Calvinists from different backgrounds, different denominations, different belief systems. As far as, like, some might be Messianic Jews, some might be Lutheran or Presbyterian or non-denominational. We can come together and disagree with Calvinism and their soteriological view, but we're not in a group together following one man's teaching like they are. So I think that's kind of ironic that they project non-Calvinists as man-made centered religions because we hold to a different interpretation, yet we're not following a system, which Calvinism is a system developed by an individual who got it from another individual. And you can say that's just like Mormonism: Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, Jehovah's Witnesses, Russell and Rutherford. You can list a number of organizations who are centered around a specific teacher on how, and that's what they follow. So I think Jeff is kind of projecting and has it backwards, because I thought that was kind of funny that he centers on that, but yet he doesn't look at himself and their poster of John Calvin and all this, that he's talking about being man-centered religion, and yet that's exactly what he's doing. But well, let's move on. I want to say that, look, I'm going to read a couple emails that I think that are important to kind of go over. This should help a lot of non-Calvinists, I think, and even help some Calvinists understand what the text is saying. One email I did get that I think is important is discussing the context of Romans 8. And let me see. I know I think it's from a gentleman, Scott, who asked me a question, Dr. Garza, regarding the context of Romans 8, 9, and 10. How is this a Jewish context or background? I think it's referring to the context. It's kind of hard sometimes to make out the emails, but that's I think it's referring to, and I think it's because Jason brought out the fact that in part of Romans it has a Jewish audience to it. It's not completely Jewish audience. I mean, Paul does address Gentiles, and he says, "I'm speaking to you Gentiles" later on in Romans 11. But in starting from 7, though, he does talk about speaking to those who know the Torah. But I want to move in a couple of key verses that I think a lot of non-Calvinists can use to pressure a Calvinist to answer and give a reason for this, because the terminology being used here is found elsewhere in Romans that identify who Paul's speaking to. Let me give you an example. In Romans chapter 8, verse 23, Paul talks about adoptions as sons, the redemption of our body. In verse 20, he says, and not only this, and I need to put my glasses on for this, and not only this, but also we ourselves having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for adoptions as sons, the redemptions of our body. Now, of course, this is speaking about the resurrection, but it makes it clear that we ourselves having the first fruits of the Spirit, and he says adoptions as sons, the redemptions of our body. Now, adoptions of sons, that's a key phrase. Even in the Greek, you can look it up, because Paul tells you in Romans 9 who the adoptions of sons belong to. So as Paul is talking about for our adoptions as sons, he says in Romans 9, my brother, he says, for I could wish that I myself were accursed, separated from Messiah, for the sake of my brother, my kinsmen according to the flesh, who are Israelites, verse 4, to whom belongs the adoption as sons and the glory of the covenants, again, the Torah, services, the promises, and so forth. So here we see again the adoption of some, same Greek term, expression in the Greek, reflecting back to verse 8, where he says, waiting eagerly for our adoptions as sons. And who does it belong to? Israelites, to whom belongs the adoptions as sons. So again, Paul makes that clear in 8, and he says that's who it belongs to. Now, you can connect. This is how you do text. This is how you do biblical exegesis. This is how you connect verses. This is how you don't just take out of context. You read what Paul's saying. There's an expression, adoption as sons. He phrases it again in 9:4 that belongs to the Israelites. And then we're going to see this again. So that's number one. The one point is adoption as sons. It belongs to the Israelites first and foremost. Now, as Gentiles are grafted in. They are brought in through faith. So that's key, because Gentiles, it doesn't belong to them first. It was to the Jew. Remember, Paul always said, to the Jew first. To the Jew first. Jesus made it clear in the Gospels that I've come only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He told his disciples, do not go to the Gentiles or to Samaritans, because I've come to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So there was a fulfillment of messianic prophecy to the Jew first, as prophesied in the Old Testament, that the Messiah is fulfilling before his death, burial, and resurrection. And when you take the Gospels at that historical context of saying before resurrection, before redemption, the Messiah is coming to the Jewish people. That's why you look at John 6 that way. And we're going to get into that a little, because I got a question. Someone asked a question about John 6, but I'll briefly talk about that. But look at what it's saying here. Adoption as sons belongs to who? Israel. Now let's take another key phrase here. In Romans chapter 8, let's connect again. In verse 28, and we know now that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined. Now, Calvinists love to use that. Those whom he foreknew, he also, those to them are the elect. Calvinists will say that's the elect. That's the elect. But is it the elect? The key word is whom he foreknew. Who did God foreknew before? Is it talking about an elect to salvation, or is it talking about a people as foretold in the Old Testament? And so Paul answers this again. Flip over to, again, we're going to do an exegesis here, because that term foreknew is used again by Paul, but Paul now tells you who he's talking about. In verse 11, in chapter 11, verse 2. Well, let's start at verse 1. I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? Now, who is his people? We're going to find out. May it never be, for I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says? He talks about Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel. So the people whom God foreknew as a people, as a nation, as Paul says, is Israel. Again, same Greek word, foreknow, the two foreknow. Again, Paul tells you in chapter 11, verse 1 and 2, that he's speaking of Israel, who he foreknew as a people, and he predestined as a people, as God's chosen. You find this in Deuteronomy, that's in the Torah. You find that in Isaiah. All the prophets speak about God's chosen people. God chose Israel, Judah, chose King David. These words have meaning. He foreknew, he predestined. So again, foreknew, the same Greek word, by the way, you can actually pinpoint these in the Greek. So he foreknew, whom he foreknew. Who's the those whom? Chapter 11, Israelite, Israel. It says, God has now rejected his people whom he foreknew. Whom he foreknew. Again, this is how you do biblical exegesis. So we have adoption as sons belonging to Israel, the people to whom he foreknew, again, Israel, chapter 11. And you find this connection throughout Scripture, even with the elect, even with the choice, where you see where people say, well, the elect of God, because Jesus says, who will bring a charge against God's elect in chapter 8? Well, who's the elect here? So we have adoption of sons, whom he foreknew, which is Israel, belongs to Israel, adoption of sons, whom he foreknew, Israel. He also predestined. And it says, who will bring a charge against God's elect? Now, Dr. White was saying, oh, this is just for the Jews, God's elect, who will bring a charge against God's Jews? Well, that's not what we're saying, Jews, but we're saying God's elect, God's chosen, which is a Greek word that's found in the Old Testament, the Septuagint. We'll translate it from the Hebrew, that refers to God's people, always in that context with that Greek word. And then we find that the elect is in the Greek the same one in chapter 11, verse 28. From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. He's talking about Israel here. But from the standpoint of elect, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. Again, this is speaking in the context of Israel. If you go back just a few, where he talks about that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles, verse 25, has come in so that all Israel will be saved, just as written. From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies, but from the standpoint of God's elect, from the standpoint of elect, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. So who is the elect there? Again, Israel. That's why he says, who will bring a charge against God's elect? Israel. The context of Romans 8, starting from verse 7:1, which Jason brought out, and Dr. White seems to be baffled by this. And he says, this is new to him. Well, I believe it's new to him because he's a reformer. He's a Western Reformed thinker. When I studied with scholars in Israel, with professors, and I asked them some of these questions about the context and the historical background of the New Testament, universally they all basically were saying this is a Jewish New Testament is a Jewish context book written in a very Semitic way. Paul is Paul is a Pharisee from the house of Hillel. Now, Hillel himself was a predominant Jewish teacher, rabbi, and he taught that man has choice to make decisions for right and wrong, and the justice of God is in his sovereignty, where he can judge men accordingly the way he sees fit. And this is what Paul would have came out of that same thinking. The Pharisees of the first century were not determinists; they were not Calvinists. So when I see videos saying, "Oh, Paul teaches Calvinism," I don't know. I would like to know from any Calvinist out there. Show me anywhere where Paul's training as a young man from the house of Hillel at the feet of Gamaliel, who was Paul's teacher, all believed that man had the freedom to choose, not taking away from God's sovereignty to pick a people, to bring judgment, to direct nations in different ways, and direct people, but that when it came to the choice of either doing good or bad, right or wrong, rejecting or accepting God, that they didn't believe that they had free will or the freedom to choose. You're not going to find it. Every major academic book I've read on the Pharisees, Second Temple Jewish, teachers like the Essenes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees from Josephus and other writers, all state the same thing. Intertestamental writings, the freedom to choose, man's freedom, free will to make decisions, not taken away from God's sovereignty. And that goes back, as they point, to the tree of knowledge. You go back to Genesis with the tree of knowledge. That Hebrew word for knowledge means discernment, to discern from right from wrong. You have the knowledge to discern. That's why God can say man has become one of us, or like one of us, knowing, discerning right from wrong. And what happens? The sin of disobedience comes into mankind. They can now make decisions and choices to do harm to people, to do good, but they choose mostly harm because now they're godlike. They have this ability to bring harm against other people in an unjust way, and that is the knowledge of doing what is right or doing what is wrong. So that even that Hebrew word gives you, from the word knowledge, gives you that discernment, and that passes down through all humanity. We all have that knowledge. So from Genesis refutes Calvinism right at the tree of the knowledge. That's why God can say man has become like one of us. Now, what does that mean? Because God was the only one to have that knowledge to do right or wrong, that was now passed on to humanity because man disobeyed God. So that alone refutes Calvinism. The whole Hebrew Bible, there's nowhere that talks about elect or elect equals salvation, or even the word grace has a different meaning in Hebrew in the Old Testament. I think someone mentioned that to me. Now, this goes back to another email I got about the terminology between a Calvinist and a non-Calvinist. And I think this is important because when we talk to Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses, we use the same terminology: Son of God, God the Son, Jesus is this. We use the same terminology, but our definitions are different. So when we say grace as non-Calvinists, and when we say elect or a choice or God's elect, we have a different interpretation than they do. They always equate it to salvation. Salvation, God has to, regenerate you with and give you the ability with the Spirit to believe, to have faith first. Yet that doesn't exist in the Hebrew Scriptures. Doesn't exist prior to the New Testament. The Jews of the first century, as the Pharisees and the teachers, and even Jesus, Yeshua himself, Jesus did not teach any of those things. It goes back to John chapter 6, and we'll get to a little later. And I made videos on this, by the way. If you scroll down my channel, you can scroll down to a lot, they're more towards the middle to the end, where I made videos on Calvinism, John 6, Ephesians 1, and Romans and all that. So you can go back and watch those to get more context, where I read into some work from the second century and other academics. But again, we have to define our terms. What is grace? How do we define grace? Does it mean the way the Calvinists view it, or does grace from the Hebrew Bible have a different meaning? Because the Greek does not reflect the Hebrew word at all. And I wrote you can go to my academia page, and read a paper I wrote called "Grace. It's Not What You Think," because I break down from the Hebrew the first time grace is used, how it's used in Hebrew, how it's a reflection of Noah's name. When when God called Noah, who was a righteous man, to build the ark. And that word grace reflects back to his name. So, grab some water here. So we have to understand, we have to define our terms, which I think is important. Once we define our terms and we kind of lay that foundation, then we can get into scripture. But these passages in Romans 8 with adoption of sons, whom he foreknew, elect, Paul tells you who they are. He says it's Israel as a nation, as a whole, as a people. That doesn't mean for salvation. Not at all. These terms do not reflect salvation the way a Calvinist interpret them. So, and those go back to not only to the Septuagint, but also to the Hebrew original wording being used for these in the Old Testament. And I think that's where we missed the mark. Well, not us. That's where Calvinists missed the mark. I'm sorry. We sometimes as non-Calvinists, sometimes we don't go far enough within the Hebrew scriptures to pull out these words. Like I said, what grace really means. Um, but a couple of these emails I've got regarding the debate reflect what the scriptures actually say. And Jason was very correct in identifying the Jewish context of Romans. I would just encourage anybody who does that again to reflect on those words in the Greek: adoption of sons, foreknew, and of course elect, being called of Israel. So Romans 8, from chapter 7, verse 1, I speak to you who know the Torah, and then he deals with the Torah, deals to the Jews on adoption of sons, whom he foreknew, he predestined, and against God's elect. And again, answered in Romans 11, speaking of Israel. Actually, chapter 9 and 11, speaking of Israel. And then he changes afterward in 11, but I'm speaking to you who are Gentiles. So there is a transition, there is a shift. This is how you do hermeneutics. You have to contextualize what's being said here, identify certain markers that we look at as words, and then find them and see how is Paul using these and in what context. Does it reflect back to what he's just saying? And he does. Remember, technically there's no chapters and verses here in the original letters. In the Greek, we have no chapters and breaks. So this is a continuous flow where he identifies what we just talked about: adoption of sons, foreknowledge, elect, and he identifies that with Israel, whom he foreknew, adoption of sons, and all those things. So we do chapters, but there is none. So even when Dr. White tries to point out this is new to him, well, yeah, it's new to him. Like I said, I've spoken to other professors who are more uh, reading in a more Eastern point of view of the Semitic background of the text, the cultural background of the text, Paul's way of doing things and thinking as a Jew, as a Pharisee, and the whole New Testament as a Semitic book or books in one. So, and how they connect to the Hebrew scriptures in a Semitic way. So we can't take away from them because that might be new to Western thinking, but it's not new to the East of how they think of things in a more Jewish context and where the New Testament came out of, which is in a Jewish background in Israel and in Jerusalem. So I think we have to look at that and kind of put that together. But again, I'll just stop right there because we're already 20 minutes in or over 20 minutes. I don't want to go too long, but those are a couple of emails I received I think I need to bring attention to. But I want to say, Jason, you did a good job. I think, yeah, there's always room for improvement. Always, even if you're a seasoned debater, there's always room for improvement. I've done debates with many different, different cults with the Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, and all the Unitarians and Apostolics, oneness. A lot of my early ministry has been in apologetics the first 10 to 15 years, going off there door to door, debating. I went to the Mormon Temple San Diego when it opened, and I was out there with signs in my 20s. So I know I've been through that area. Of course, my area of study has changed as far as my priority, but I did apologetics for almost 15 years, and I've dealt with different groups. Yeah, a lot of non-Calvinists might say don't believe Calvinists are a cult, but they're very cultic the way they think, the way they say things, and they project a lot of things that they themselves are doing onto others. Like what Jeff said about mad-centric theology, when that's their whole theology is surrounded by John Calvin. So I thought that's interesting. But again, we need to define our terms, connect the verses, look for key marker words in there to piece them out and see how are they identified, how are they understood. Look at the historical background and culture of Paul. Paul alone, his background does not fit Calvinism the way they think he does because of where he came out of. You have to look at his school, the school that he was trained at, what they believed, and that's key because that lays a foundation of what Paul would have been writing to these Jewish and Gentiles and even Greek Jews in the letters he's written. Because, like Jason brought out, and he's very correct, and I've said this many times in my videos, Paul went from synagogue to synagogue to synagogue. It was to the Jew first, and that's what Paul says, to the Jew first, following, exactly what Jesus did with coming to, the people of Israel, to the Jews, and bringing the Messiah before his death, burial, and resurrection. And Paul is emphasizing that that he's going to the Jew first. If they reject him, if they don't want to listen to him, then he goes to the Gentiles, to the nations. Now we had Hebrew Jews and Greek Jews, and you see that in Acts 6:1, where they're already, before any Gentile came in. We have to define those terms too: Gentile, Hellenist, and Jew, because in Acts 6:1, so you have Hebrew Jews and Greek Jews. These were Jews who become under the Greek culture, obviously, who stayed in, under that culture from the time of the Greeks. So they're still Jews, but they're under Greek culture. And then you have Gentiles; those are from the nations who have no Jewish affiliate at all. They're not Jews at all. So you see that in Acts 6:1 until you get to the first Gentile and the next chapter. So we have to define our terms, bring these into context, look at things like adoption of sons, whom he foreknew, God's elect, and Paul tells who he's talking to. And then, of course, Paul's background, the Hebrew background of these words. So I hope this helps a little bit to help you build off of that, because I think it's important. I think we need to really do our studies in those areas. The debate was very interesting to me. I think it had a lot of things that I saw in there from Dr. White with his condescending attitude towards Jason. He liked to think like, it's funny because I think Dr. White seems to think like he's the final authority on everything. Like what he says, and that's it. There's nothing else. There's no anybody who disagrees with them has a different gospel or a different way. I mean, he dismisses scholars who are higher than him, who have more academic training and reading, and he dismisses them. We won't even look at them, even consider them. Now, look, we all have our own beliefs, but I read from scholars and just like Dr. Flowers does, I read from many different scholars. I don't agree with everything they say, but I read their work, and a lot of things they say from a historical, cultural background is true. Now, our conclusions might be different, but the premise is all the same. So I read from multiple different scholars, just like Dr. Flowers does, and others who we are always learning. So I always look at people who are higher in scholarship than I am, who have been doing it longer than I am, who are out there doing the work. If they're in Israel, they're right there in the forefront of it all. And I read their work. I want to say, how do they see this? And none of them affirm Calvinism in their soteriological view. Zero. And these are men right there in Israel doing the work, looking at the manuscripts, looking at the Jewish literature, looking at the history of Judaism and how it reflects into the New Testament and where it comes from, and all these things we talk about Paul and Paul's background and thinking. None of it affirms Calvinism in their soteriological view. None of them. And they're not all Christians, but these are scholars that put out the work. So we need to do that. So we need to examine all this. And the next time I might even show you some of the books that I have from academia from these men who I think did a great job bringing out the background, the Semitic background of the New Testament and the culture and all those things. But again, I want to say thank you for tuning in. I want to say thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe. Share this video if it's helped you. That's how we grow this channel. We grow it together. But I want to say thank you. God bless, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bible Answers with Dr. Al Garza.